Hi everyone, it's Nini. Welcome to my channel. I am in Mount Moriah Cemetery in Deadwood, South Dakota. Deadwood was founded during a gold rush in the late 1800s and was the epitome of the Old West. The town holds a lot of history and a lot of well-known people lived and died here. I wanted to talk about some of those people, and most of them are buried in this cemetery. So I thought we'd visit their graves and learn a little bit about them. And just FYI, it costs $2 to see this cemetery, and they do prefer cash. I didn't have any cash, but they do take a card, but it has to be a minimum of $8 on the card, so I said just charge me the $8. And one thing that I am very appreciative of, there is a bathroom here. Probably the most famous resident of Deadwood was Wild Bill Hickok, who is buried right here. He's one of the most well-known residents, but he was only in Deadwood for a few weeks before he was murdered. James Butler Hickok was born in 1837 in Illinois. He occasionally used his dad's name, William. People started to call him Duck Bill because he had a big nose and his top lip stuck out. He grew a mustache to supposedly hide his lip. People still called him Bill, and he added Wild in front of it to make it sound cooler. When Bill was 18, he moved to Kansas and worked as a sheriff. He later worked as a marshal in Missouri. Bill took part in a lot of gunfights and became famous for how good a marksman he was. He could quickly pull out his gun and hit his target. He had been skilled at this from a very young age. Bill killed at least 6 people in his lifetime, including his deputy marshal after he accidentally shot him during a shootout. Bill was really destroyed by this and never took part in another gunfight. It also ended his career as a lawman. Bill joined Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show for a bit, but he hated it. He hated acting and he hated being under the spotlights. During one show, when the light focused on him, he pulled his gun out and shot the light. Part of his frustration over the lights could be because they hurt his eyes. Bill developed an unknown eye condition that caused him to have poor vision. Some say at the time of his death, he was almost blind. In July 1871, when Bill was 34, he met a 45-year-old widow named Agnes. They got married in March 1876 in Wyoming. A few months later in July, Bill joined a wagon train led by Charlie Utter. Charlie organized 30 wagons full of prospectors, gamblers, prostitutes to come to Deadwood, where gold had recently been discovered. Calamity Jane was also part of that wagon train, but more on her later. Once in Deadwood, Bill spent a lot of his time gambling. On August 1st, 1876, Bill was playing poker in Saloon Number 10. Also playing was Jack McCall, but he was very drunk and lost very badly. Bill gave him money to buy breakfast. For some reason, this insulted Jack. The next day, Bill went into Saloon Number 10 to play poker again. Anywhere he was, he never sat with his back facing the door, but that day the only seat available was facing away from the door. He supposedly asked some other people at the table to switch spots with him, but nobody would. Bill sat down with his back facing the door and started playing poker. Jack McCall entered the saloon, went up to Bill, and shot him in the back of his head as he said, quote, "Damn you, take that," unquote. Bill died instantly. He was only 39. Legend says that the cards Bill was holding when he was shot were a pair of aces and eights and is now known as the dead man's hand, and you see those cards all over Deadwood. But when I was in the Adams Museum, it said that actually wasn't true, and him holding a pair of aces and eights was just a story made up. There were no laws in Deadwood at the time of Bill's murder, so some miners gathered and held an informal trial. They found Jack McCall not guilty because he claimed he shot Bill to avenge his father's death, and apparently in the miners' eyes, that was a valid reason to be able to shoot somebody. After being acquitted, Jack supposedly went around bragging how he killed Wild Bill Hickok. His boasting didn't last long, though, because he was retried and yanked in for a real trial and found guilty. He was hung in 1877. They buried him with the noose still around his neck. Almost the entire town of Deadwood attended Bill Hickok's funeral because he was such a well-known guy. Charlie Utter was his good friend and paid for a wooden grave marker. Bill was originally buried in Ingleside Cemetery, but in 1879, Charlie Utter paid to have him moved up here to the new Mount Moriah Cemetery, where he is today. When they exhumed Bill to move him, they found out that the chemicals in the soil had petrified his body. One of the grave workers tapped his body with a shovel, and it was so hard that it sounded like he was hitting a brick. This made his body very heavy. They think around 400 pounds. So can you imagine how difficult that was to move him up the hill? They moved his original grave marker to the new grave, but people kept chipping pieces off of it to keep as souvenirs. It was replaced with a sculpture of him, but I think the head was cut off of that. And that sculpture is in the Adams Museum. That sculpture was replaced with the current sculpture that's there today. And note the fence to try to keep people out from vandalizing it. And just FYI, Charlie Utter is not buried here. He is buried in Panama. After the fire of 1879 destroyed most of the town of Deadwood, Charlie left South Dakota. Look at all the items that people have left for Bill. Cigarettes, scrunchie, pine cones, bullets, an inhaler. I wonder what that's about. My favorite though is somebody left a dead man's hand. I think that's kind of cool. Right next to Wild Bill is Calamity Jane. She was an interesting woman. She was an alcoholic who cursed like a sailor and preferred to wear men's clothing. She was born Martha Jane Cannery in 1852 in Missouri and was the oldest of 6 kids. When she was 12, the family headed west. During the trip, her mother died from pneumonia. Just a year later, her dad died. So at age 14, Jane took over caring for her younger siblings and moved them to Wyoming. She took on whatever job she could get: dishwasher, dance hall girl, waitress, and allegedly prostitution. According to her, she got her nickname during a fight with natives where she saved the life of a captain. He apparently told her, quote, "I name you Calamity Jane, the heroine of the plains," unquote. Another version is that she would tell men if they offended her, they would be, quote unquote, courting calamity. It's not known when she started drinking, but Jane was a very heavy drinker. I mean, she was a flat-out serious alcoholic. In a way, you can't blame her because her life started out so rough. In 1876, she joined Charlie Utter's wagon train in Wyoming and headed to Deadwood. That is how she met Wild Bill Hickok. She had a big crush on him, but it was not reciprocated. As you could probably guess, his death hit Jane really hard. She allegedly tried to go after Jack McCall with a meat cleaver. Despite Jane's tough front, she had a soft spot for children. Deadwood was hit with a smallpox outbreak in August 1876. Jane was immune because she survived smallpox as a child, so she took care of sick children. Some of the children who died from smallpox and other diseases are buried in a mass grave in Mount Moriah. Jane moved to Montana in 1881. It's not known how many children she had in her life, but when she returned to South Dakota in 1903, she had a girl with her who she said was her daughter. Jane lived in Belle Fourche and worked at a brothel, but not as a prostitute. She did the cooking and the laundry. In July 1903, she got on a train headed for the tiny town of Terry near Deadwood. She became ill, and when they arrived in Terry, she was brought to a hotel. A doctor came, but Jane was too sick. Calamity Jane died on August 1st, 1903, at the age of 51 from inflammation of her bowels and pneumonia. Why Jane is buried next to Bill is not known for sure. There is a sign down there that says her dying wish was to be buried next to him because she was apparently still in love with him when she died. I think she even claimed that Bill was the only man she ever loved, but she was married twice. But then again, just because you're married doesn't mean it's a happy marriage filled with love. Some say the people of Deadwood played a posthumous joke on Bill because they knew how little he thought of her, so they thought it would be funny to bury her next to him. Regardless, they are side by side for all of eternity. I think people are paying their respects to Calamity Jane by leaving all of these items. Look at this, somebody left a bottle of liquor. I do think it's kind of interesting that she was not a feminine woman, but there's very few graves in the cemetery that have flowers, but hers has these really pretty yellow flowers. Right next to Wild Bill is Potato Creek Johnny. He was a prospector, and when you picture a prospector, you probably picture an old man with like a giant beard. That is exactly what he looked like. Potato Creek Johnny's real name was John Parrott. I don't know if I pronounced that right. Maybe it's kind of French, like parade or something. He was a little dude at just 4'3". He got his nickname because he was panning gold on Potato Creek and discovered what is said to be the largest gold nugget ever found in the Black Hills. This caused him to be instantly famous, and they kind of made a little tourist attraction out of him where people could take pictures with him, and I think he went on shows or something. Johnny sold the nugget to W.E. Adams for $250, and he put it on display in his Adams Museum. And you can see that nugget today in the museum. I highly recommend the Adams Museum because you can see how much cool historical items they have there. Al Swearengen isn't buried in the cemetery. He is buried in Denver, but he is one of Deadwood's famous residents, so I did want to talk about him. Al was born in Iowa in 1845. He came to Deadwood in 1876 due to the gold rush. He opened a saloon called the Gem Theater, which was also a dance hall and brothel. Al was a nasty, nasty man. He took advantage of desperate young girls and forced them into prostitution. He would tell them he was bringing them to Deadwood for cleaning or waitressing jobs and pay for their way here. Some women were told they were going to Deadwood to marry some of the miners, which was a lie. When the women arrived in Deadwood, Al told them they were going to work as prostitutes. How scary would that be? To move to a completely different town where you know nobody, and you had the idea that you were either going to work as a waitress or you were going to marry your husband, and instead you are forced into prostitution. Because Al paid for the women's way to Deadwood, if they told him they didn't want to work as prostitutes, he demanded they repay him. But they had no money, and they knew nobody in town. So they literally had no other option but to work for Al. I did hear a story that there was one woman who flat out protested being a prostitute, so Al tied her up in chains in the basement and refused to give her food or water. Eventually, though, some people were able to get to her and help her escape, and they got her on a train out of Deadwood. What else could those poor women have done even if Al did let them go? Because they had no money, they were young and alone in a strange place full of rowdy miners, miles away from family. The Gem was very profitable. An average nightly income was up to $10,000 at the time, which is around $300,000 in today's money. And they made that in one night. When the men of Deadwood were not out panning for gold, trying to get rich, they passed the time by drinking, gambling, and hanging out with women. And the Gem provided all of those comforts, if you want to call it that. The Gem burned down in the fire of 1879, but Al rebuilt it and it was just as successful. When efforts were put in to try to clean up Deadwood, Al was able to keep his businesses protected because he had several alliances. He also controlled the town's opium trade. In 1899, the Gem burned down again. There were a lot of fires in Deadwood. This time, Al decided not to rebuild, and he left Deadwood. In 1904, when Al was 59, he was found dead on a street in Denver. It's thought he was murdered. The location of the Gem Theater is where the Mineral Palace and Casino is today on Main Street. Now let's head up the hill and see the grave of Seth Bullock. This is the grave of Seth Bullock. I think the rocks and pine cones on top are people's way of paying their respects to him. He was Deadwood's first sheriff, and he was known for taming Deadwood without killing anyone. Seth was born in Canada in 1849. His childhood was rough because his father beat him. When he was 16, Seth ran away to Montana to live with his sister. When he was a little older, he became a sheriff and helped create Yellowstone National Park. In 1874, he married Martha. He started a hardware store in Montana with his business partner, Sol Star. When they heard of the gold rush in Deadwood, they thought their business would do better there, so they came to Deadwood in August 1876 and built a hardware store. There were no laws in Deadwood at the time, so it was a very wild and rowdy place. It was not a place to raise a family. So Martha and their daughter went to live with family in Michigan. Seth and Sol arrived in Deadwood either shortly before or shortly after Wild Bill was murdered. It was his murder that caused the people of Deadwood to be like, okay, we need law and order. And they knew of Seth's background as a sheriff, so they asked him to be Deadwood's first sheriff, and he accepted. Seth was only sheriff for 9 months, but he took his job very seriously and was able to clean up the town. Seth was a very intimidating man. He was tall, had broad shoulders, and a stare that could scare a cobra, so legend says. And just check out his fabulous mustache. Seth had a reputation for being fearless, so that and his intimidating nature allowed him to clean up Deadwood without killing anyone. Once Deadwood was a more civil place to live, Martha and their daughter moved here. In 1879, Seth and Sol started a ranch near Belle Fourche called the S&B Company. Seth was apparently the first farmer to plant alfalfa in South Dakota. Seth and Sol's hardware store burned down in 1894. They decided to rebuild it as a hotel and called it the Bullock Hotel. It was Deadwood's first luxury hotel since it had indoor bathrooms on each floor. It is still a functioning hotel today and has a casino on the first floor. But it is said to be haunted by ghosts of Deadwood's past. Seth met Theodore Roosevelt in 1884 and they became close friends. Theodore said Seth was a true Westerner and the finest type of frontiersman. After Theodore became president, Seth was appointed U.S. Marshal for South Dakota for 9 years. After Roosevelt died in 1919, Seth built a monument to him on Sheep Mountain, which was renamed Mount Roosevelt. That monument is known as the Friendship Tower. Just 2 months after the monument was completed, Seth died from colon cancer at the age of 70. His grave faces Mount Roosevelt. I don't see the Friendship Tower, though. Martha Bullock died in 1939 and was buried next to her husband. And just look what it says on their gravestones. Seth Bullock, pioneer. Martha, his wife. Like that's the only thing she ever accomplished in her life was being his wife. I hope you enjoyed learning about some of Deadwood's famous residents. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.